year is 701 BCE. In the shadow of Nineveh's massive walls, where the Tigris River runs red with something that isn't sunset, a line of women wait in chains. They are daughters of Lachish, a fortified city in Judah that made the mistake of resisting Assyrian conquest. They are young, some barely past childhood, and they are about to discover that death would have been mercy. Behind them, carved into limestone panels that will survive millennia, artisans are creating a record of this moment. But the stone reliefs won't show what happens next. They'll show the siege, the conquest, the tribute. They won't show the screaming that echoes through the Assyrian camp tonight. Some truths are too horrible even for stone. What you're about to witness isn't just ancient brutality. It's a system so calculated, so deeply woven into the fabric of Assyrian religion and politics, that it defined an empire for 3 centuries. The sexual practices of the Assyrians weren't excesses of war. They were weapons of terror, tools of control, and rituals considered sacred by the priests who oversaw them. If you've ever wondered how far human cruelty can go when blessed by religion and protected by power, you're in the right place. Here we examine archaeological evidence that challenges comfortable narratives. Cuneiform tablets describing rituals that scholars debated for decades before translating publicly. Relief carvings that were deliberately damaged by later civilizations horrified by what they depicted. Every view helps us continue this work of historical recovery. Now let's return to those women in chains, because what happens to them tonight will reveal the first truth about Assyrian sexual practices. They weren't random acts of violence. They were policy, blessed by the goddess Ishtar herself. To understand Assyrian sexuality, you must first understand their goddess of war and sex. Ishtar was depicted in temple art as both armed warrior and sexually voracious female. She demanded blood and semen in equal measure, and her cult provided religious justification for practices that even other ancient civilizations found extreme. The cult of Ishtar maintained temples in every major Assyrian city. Inside these temples, something happened that combined religion, prostitution, and political control in ways that destroyed thousands of lives. Let's talk about sacred prostitution, but not the sanitized version you might have read in textbooks. Cuneiform tablets from the Temple of Ishtar at Nineveh, translated only in recent decades, describe the initiation of young women into temple service. The tablets use euphemisms, but the meaning is clear. Girls as young as 12 would be dedicated to the goddess by their families, sometimes willingly as an honor, sometimes sold when families couldn't pay taxes. These girls would undergo a ritual defloration by a priest of Ishtar. The ritual was public, performed before witnesses, and considered essential to consecrating the girl to the goddess's service. The priest would penetrate her with a phallus made of bronze or stone representing the goddess's sacred power. If the girl screamed too loudly, other priestesses would cover her mouth with cloth soaked in date wine to muffle the sound. The blood from her torn hymen would be collected in a bowl and poured over a statue of Ishtar. After this initiation, the girl was considered married to the goddess and would serve in the temple for life. Her service included accepting any man who offered sufficient donation to the temple. The donations were recorded meticulously in temple accounts. The girls kept nothing. They lived in cells within the temple complex, fed barely enough to survive, and were beaten if they refused customers. British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard, excavating Nineveh in the 1840s, discovered a section of the Temple of Ishtar that wasn't included in his published reports. His private letters, now in the British Museum archives, describe finding rooms with shackles built into the walls and drainage channels in the floors. The smell, even after 2,500 years, was distinctive enough that his workers refused to continue excavating that section. What Layard found were the cells where temple prostitutes who became pregnant or diseased were confined. Cuneiform administrative tablets found in the same area record that these women were left to die, their bodies disposed of in mass graves outside the city. One tablet notes that 17 women died in a single month during winter. Another records payment to workers for disposing of bodies. Think about that for a moment. These weren't criminals. They were victims of a system that used religion to justify sexual slavery, then discarded them when they were no longer useful. And this happened in every major Assyrian city for 3 centuries. But temple prostitution was just one aspect of how the Assyrians weaponized sexuality. Let's talk about what happened when Assyrian armies conquered a city, because this is where religious practice merged with military policy to create something uniquely horrible. Assyrian military reliefs are famous for their detailed depictions of conquest. Museums display them as examples of ancient art. What they don't emphasize is what those reliefs actually show. If you look closely at panels from the Palace of Ashurbanipal, now in the British Museum, you see captive women in poses that aren't ambiguous. They're being raped. The sculptors carved these scenes with the same careful detail they used for depicting the king. Why? Because the Assyrians believed that the total domination of a conquered people required the public sexual humiliation of their women. This wasn't soldiers getting out of control. This was organized policy. Cuneiform military orders recovered from Assyrian archives include specific instructions about the treatment of captured women. One tablet from the reign of Sennacherib orders that women of conquered cities be divided into 3 categories. Category 1. Virgins of noble families, to be sent to the king's harem. Category 2. Women of childbearing age, to be distributed to soldiers as rewards. Category 3. Women past childbearing age, and those who resisted too much, to be used in temple sacrifices. That third category deserves special attention. Let's talk about what human sacrifice meant in Assyrian ritual practice. The cult of Ishtar demanded blood, usually animal blood. But on special occasions, particularly after major military victories, the goddess required human offerings. And the Assyrians believed that the suffering of the victim enhanced the power of the sacrifice. A fragmentary text from Ashur, the old Assyrian capital, describes a victory ritual performed after the conquest of Babylon in 689 BCE. 28 women captured in the city were taken to the temple of Ishtar. They were stripped, bound, and placed in a courtyard. Then temple prostitutes, themselves victims of the system, were required to torture these women over the course of several days. The text describes burning, cutting, and sexual violation with objects as part of the ritual preparation. The screaming was considered prayer to the goddess. When the women were finally killed, their blood was used to consecrate new statues of Ishtar. Their bodies were dismembered, and the parts were distributed to other temples across the empire. This wasn't an isolated incident. Assyrian kings boasted in their annals about offering captive women to Ishtar. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions mention dedicating female captives from Elam to the goddess. The euphemistic language suggests these women weren't just becoming temple servants. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Assyrian sexual practice was what they did with the wives and daughters of defeated kings. This combined humiliation, control, and sexual violence in ways designed to break not just individuals, but entire cultures. When the Assyrians defeated a rival king, they would demand his wives and daughters as tribute. These women would be transported to Nineveh in a parade designed to maximize humiliation. They would be stripped, chained, and forced to walk through the streets while citizens threw filth and stones. The parade would end at the royal palace, where the Assyrian king would decide their fate. A cuneiform letter from the court of Ashurbanipal describes what happened to the daughter of the king of Elam after his defeat. She was 18 years old. The letter notes that she was beautiful, which the writer treats as unfortunate because it meant the king took personal interest in her case. She was kept in the palace for 3 months, during which she was repeatedly raped by the king and his nobles. The letter records that she stopped speaking after the first week. When the king tired of her, she was given to the temple of Ishtar in Nineveh. A later tablet notes that a priestess from Elam who wouldn't stop crying was beaten to death by temple guards. The dates match. It was almost certainly the same woman. This pattern repeated across the empire. The daughters of conquered kings became objects demonstrating the totality of Assyrian victory. They would be kept alive, imprisoned in temples or harems, living reminders to their people that even royal blood offered no protection from Assyrian power. The Assyrians also practiced a form of forced marriage that combined politics with sexual violence in particularly cruel ways. When they conquered a territory but wanted to maintain a local ruler as a puppet, they would force that ruler to marry an Assyrian woman. But calling her a wife misunderstands her role. These women were spies, enforcers, and symbols of Assyrian dominance. Cuneiform correspondence between Assyrian kings and their provincial governors includes letters from these women reporting on their husbands' activities, their conversations, their potential disloyalty. The women were trained in poison, in seduction, in how to extract information, and they knew that their own lives depended on keeping their husbands under control. One letter from a woman named Libeli Sharat, married to a king in Syria, reports that her husband had begun talking about rebellion. She asks for guidance. The response, preserved in the royal archives, is chilling. She is instructed to prevent his rebellion by any means necessary, including killing him if required, and if she fails, she will be recalled to Nineveh, where her failure will be punished according to the laws of Ishtar. We don't know what happened to Libeli Sharat, but we know that her husband died under mysterious circumstances 6 months later, and Assyrian records note that the Syrian throne passed smoothly to a more compliant ruler. The report mentions that the previous king's wife had performed her duty admirably. Whether she poisoned him or simply reported enough information that the Assyrians could arrange his death, we'll never know. Either way, she was trapped in a system that forced her to choose betraying her husband or facing torture herself. The Assyrians also practiced surgical castration on a scale that dwarfed even the Persians. They needed eunuchs to guard their massive harems, but they also used castration as a punishment and as a form of tribute. Subject peoples were required to provide a quota of boys for castration annually. Assyrian medical texts written on clay tablets describe the castration procedure with clinical detail. The operation was performed without anesthetic. The survival rate was approximately 1 in 3. Those who survived were trained as administrators, guards, and servants. Those who died were recorded in accounting tablets as acceptable losses. But here's what makes it worse. The Assyrians specifically targeted the most beautiful boys from conquered peoples because they wanted the survivors to serve in their palaces and temples. Families in conquered territories would hide their sons or deliberately scar them to make them less attractive. Assyrian military units included specialists whose job was to search for hidden boys and verify that tribute quotas were met. One tablet from the reign of Esarhaddon notes that a provincial governor had failed to meet his quota of eunuchs. The tablet records that the governor's own son was taken to make up the shortage. Whether this was punishment or simply efficient resource allocation, the tablet doesn't say, but it notes that the boy was 12 years old. The sexual practices of the Assyrian royal court itself deserve attention because they combined absolute power with religious justification in ways that created systematic horror. The king wasn't just a political leader. He was the earthly representative of the god Ashur. And like Ishtar, Ashur was believed to demand both blood and sexual potency from his representative. Assyrian kings were expected to maintain massive harems as proof of their divine favor and masculine power. The size of a king's harem was recorded in royal inscriptions alongside military victories. Ashurbanipal boasted of having over 800 women in his harem. These weren't just wives and concubines. They were a collection demonstrating the king's dominance over the entire empire. The harem was organized in a strict hierarchy. At the top were the king's official wives, usually daughters of other kings or high nobles. Below them were concubines of various ranks. At the bottom were women who had been given as tribute or captured in war. The women at the bottom had no names in official records. They were listed by their origin: the Egyptian, the Elamite, the Greek. Life in the lower ranks of the harem was hell dressed in silk. These women were available to the king at any time but might go years without being called. They couldn't leave, couldn't marry, couldn't have children with anyone but a king who viewed them as interchangeable. They lived under constant surveillance by eunuchs who reported any suspicious behavior. And the punishments for sexual misconduct were calculated to terrify everyone in the harem. A tablet from the Middle Assyrian laws, dating to the 12th century BCE, prescribes punishments for women in the royal harem who commit adultery or are even suspected of it. The punishment begins with public torture. The woman would be stripped and displayed in the palace courtyard. Then she would be mutilated, her nose cut off, her breasts cut off, before being killed. But that wasn't the end. Her body would be fed to dogs while her family watched. Any man suspected of being her lover would be castrated and then impaled, left to die slowly on a stake planted in front of the palace. And any servant who had failed to report suspicious behavior would be blinded and sold into slavery. These punishments were carried out regularly enough that there are multiple cuneiform records of them. They weren't threats, they were standard procedure. Fear was how the Assyrian kings maintained control over harems containing hundreds of women. The Assyrians also practiced a form of sexual mutilation on conquered peoples that was designed to create permanent marks of subjugation. When they conquered a city, they would sometimes cut off the noses of all adult women who weren't young enough for the harem or old enough for sacrifice. This served multiple purposes. It marked them permanently as conquered, making it impossible for them to blend back into normal society. It destroyed their ability to marry or form relationships. And it served as a walking advertisement of what resistance to Assyria cost. Archaeological evidence from mass graves outside conquered cities has revealed skeletons of women with severe damage to facial bones consistent with this practice. One mass grave at Lachish, dated to Sennacherib's conquest, contained remains of 112 women, all showing signs of facial mutilation before death. The legacy of Assyrian sexual practices is still visible today if you know where to look. The Islamic State's treatment of Yazidi women in 2014 followed patterns established 3,000 years ago by the Assyrians. Systematic rape as a weapon of conquest. Forced conversion. Sexual slavery justified by twisted religious interpretation. The methods were identical because they work. Sexual terror breaks populations in ways that military force alone cannot. Today, museums display Assyrian art and celebrate their military prowess. The British Museum has entire rooms devoted to Assyrian palace reliefs. Tour guides describe their sophisticated administration and impressive architecture. What they don't mention is that this civilization maintained one of the most systematic programs of sexual violence in human history. The cuneiform tablets describing temple prostitution, human sacrifice, and the treatment of conquered women exist in museum archives, but they're not translated for public display. The relief carvings showing sexual violence are labeled as depicting tribute or punishment, without explaining what's actually being depicted. The mass graves of mutilated women are excavated, and then quietly reburied. This matters because we're still living in a world where sexual violence is used as a weapon, where rape in war is systematic policy, where women's bodies are treated as territory to be conquered. The Assyrians understood something that modern armies rediscover in every conflict. Sexual violence doesn't just harm individuals. It destroys communities, breaks families, and creates terror that lasts for generations. You've just witnessed a civilization that turned sexual violence into religion, policy, and art. If this disturbs you, good. It should. The Assyrians weren't primitive barbarians. They were sophisticated empire builders who understood exactly how to use sexual terror as a tool of control. If you want to understand the roots of sexual violence in warfare, subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering these truths. Leave a comment about what shocked you most. And remember, the Assyrian Empire lasted for 3 centuries and created monuments that still stand today. But the women they destroyed left no monuments. Only bones in unmarked graves and testimony carved in stone that we've spent 2,000 years trying not to see. The ruins of Nineveh still stand in Iraq. The walls are impressive. The gates are magnificent. And beneath them, if you dig deep enough, you find the graves of women whose bodies built that empire. Their silence demands to be heard.